Hi there, how's it going? So a question often arises, particularly from people who might watch some Systema videos and they're not really sure what's going on. Most often it's instructional, or it's about developing a particular attribute, but they take it as a technique and they say that would never work against resistance, and how come you never work against resistance? Well, there's a few things to unpack there, but what I want to focus on today is this idea of working against resistance. First thing to say is, why would I want to work against resistance? Much better for me to work around the resistance, but I'll explain that as we go on. The second thing is, this normally comes from people who are technique orientated, and of course some arts are more technique centric than others. So there you learn a movement, you learn a technique, you learn to apply the technique on the person. So that's a technique against a straight punch, say. Now I need to learn a technique against the hook, against this type of grab, etc, etc. So you build up this catalogue of techniques. Now in terms of working those against resistance, of course, you need to work... I don't really like the word resistance in training. I prefer to think of things as being active. So I'm working against an active partner or person, depending on what stage you're at. Of course, in the preliminary stages of learning stage, everyone is being fairly relaxed and cooperative, but as you go up, that cooperation can decrease. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is just offering resistance, because that implies to me like just tension, a sort of static tension. But if the person is responding to what I'm doing, then that's a much better way to test something, but not a technique. Because if we're testing a technique, if I know what technique you're going to apply on me, 99% I can spoil that technique. In that circumstance, no technique works. So for us in Systema, we're getting away from this idea of technique and instead focusing on principle. Now granted, I might sometimes use a technique in order to illustrate a principle, but we always make it very clear that that is only working in that very specific set of circumstances. If an angle changes, if a position changes, then I need to know the underlying principle of that technique in order to make it work. This approach means we become much more adaptable to a situation. We don't just have a hammer every time, regardless of whether the problem is a nail or not. We have a range of options, and of course a lot of those options are built around our ability to move. And in order to cultivate that ability to move, we have to understand tension in ourselves, and then to work against an alive person or an active person, we have to understand tension in the other person, because resistance most often comes through tension. So let's take a look at a couple of ideas of how we can work around resistance. So we'll work a very simple setup just to demonstrate the principles, and Jay is just going to sort of grab me like that kind of thing, you know, very typical sort of self-defense sort of setup. Now if we're working from a technique base, I can think of a dozen techniques from here. And if Jay's being the nice martial arts student, right, they're all going to work, right? This, okay. That's working from a technique base. But then we get that problem. If he applies resistance and tension now, Jay's a strong guy, so if he applies his strength now, suddenly those things don't start working. So a technique is only good in the right circumstances. Instead, in Systema, what we're looking at is working principle based. So we get this idea of, here's where his resistance is. Why do I want to work against his resistance? That's like if we've got armies lined up, I'm going to scout out, and there's the strongest point in your defence. You've got machine gun emplacements, you've got a minefield, you've got all that stuff. Or we scout around, oh look, there's a little gap over there, that's where we're going to focus, right? So rather than work into his resistance where he is, I'm going to go where he isn't. Because if I try and work against his strength, then it's not going to happen. But there's no strength here. Once I'm through there, the strength is gone. Okay. There are ways, if I want to work, I can work directly into his tension, right? So I can hit it maybe to relax it, I can hit him somewhere else, all that sort of stuff to move his tension, to relax it. But your primary method, certainly in Systema, should always be that movement. Because when I move now, not only do I escape, but I start positioning myself to work back against him. And now here, again, be strong. So am I going to work against his resistance or his tension there? Or do I go to an area where there's no resistance and work against that? Yes is the answer. In case you were wondering. So that's the first aspect. Why would I work directly against someone's tension, particularly if he's strong? And this is where you get this idea of, well, we're going to take the best technique from this and the best technique from that. It's nonsense, because a technique can always work and a technique will never work. If you tell me what technique you're going to do, 99% I can counter it with a bit of experience, right? So people who do this, oh, we tested this technique out and it didn't work. Well, because he knows what you're doing. And normally when people do that on YouTube, they don't do the technique, right? Anyway, they're trying to prove a point. So, rather than resistance, because this is it's kind of real, but it's not really how people do it, is it? Is the other thing. So now he's going to come up and he's going to mean it, and he's going to push me into the wall. So suddenly my technique has gone again, because, sorry, can you just step back a bit? There we go. Right, then I can apply the technique. If I apply movement, I'll do exactly the same thing I just did. It doesn't matter if he's coming in fast and with aggression. Movement is just movement, you know? And so please, doesn't matter how strong and aggressive he is here, if I'm moving into that gap, then his strength and aggression is over there, and I'm already positioning to do something else. Or when people say, do you ever work against resistance? Well, no. You can work directly against it, so that's not strictly true. But your default position is always to move away from the tension and the resistance, and then work into the weak points. That's why our primary defence is movement. Also, when I'm moving, if I'm doing a technique, see my hands are kind of tied up. When I'm moving, however I'm moving, I've got the hands free to hit. You know? Feet for defence, hands for attack. So of course you need to train that in different ways, and you can start slow and you can build up speed, you can get into your sparring and testing phase and everything else. But what you're always looking to avoid is this kind of thing, because tension just feeds tension. Everyone gets more tense, nothing happens. The more relaxed you can be, then the easier things become. But that problem is, it looks easy when you see people who can do it really well, but to get that takes a lot of training. Well, not a lot of training, the right sort of training. So I hope that's one illustration of how you can work against tension or direct resistance. The key is in the movement. Of course there are other options. As I said, we can hit into that tension to destroy it, we can work to another part of the body in order to move that tension, but everything really is based around our fundamental ability to move. And when you train this way and you can develop this movement within the body, you'll find your work in general will become more effective, more efficient, more smooth, and that of course goes over into your everyday life, and this way of training is very good for your general health and well-being as well. As always, please let me know any thoughts, comments or suggestions below, or drop me an email at systemauk@outlook.com. And if you'd like access to more detailed instruction, click the join button below. That will take you to our member channel. If you sign up to that, you get a download pretty much every week on various topics. We go into depth on a lot of topics, and as a member you can make requests, you can ask questions, and I'll answer those on video for you. And there is also access to training over Zoom as well. In the meantime, don't forget to click the like button, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you soon.